So we're going to talk today about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. It's specifically Title I, the Grid Infrastructure and Resiliency, and grant programs created under the Act to be administered by the U.S. Department of Energy, and specifically the Grid Deployment Office. And today we'll cover the Grid Infrastructure and Resiliency grants, monitoring mandates and how to fulfill them, and then the requirements under the Uniform Guidance 2 CFR 200. And of course, CFR is the acronym for Code of Federal Regulations. We will also talk about new requirements under 2 CFR 910. And actually, before we go any further, I'd just like to follow up on Jill's introduction. I had, before moving to the Vanderweel Group, I've been the Chief Legal Officer for the Division for Disaster Recovery and Mitigation, and we were designated the grantee for the state for the ARPA funds. So I was part of the group hands-on administering that grant. So I can understand very much how many of you feel in your capacity. I assume that many of you are probably involved with the grants from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and administering those. And I do realize that with every funding source seems to come a new wrinkle with respect to the rules. And in this case, that is the 2 CFR 910 supplement. Okay, Subtitle A, the Grid Infrastructure, Resilience, and Reliability is specifically what we'll be addressing. And this topic in particular resonates with me because I also was involved in the administration of the Hurricane Sandy recovery funds, also for New Jersey, with our division as the grantee. And Hurricane Sandy wreaked havoc on our wastewater treatment plants. And through power failures in New Jersey at the plants, and then flooding that I believe led to power failures in New York, we had 11 billion gallons of partially treated or raw sewage dumped into our waterways and actually bubbling up through the some of the streets. So this is not the most obvious example we would have of flooding and the effects of natural disasters affecting the grid, affecting power, but it was certainly a very negative outcome, and again, something that keeps this topic close to my heart. If we look at specifically the grid programs here, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act has appropriated $10 billion for these grants to enhance grid flexibility and improve the resilience of the power system against the growing threats of extreme weather and climate change. So the two programs are $5 billion each, the Grid Innovation Program, and then the Grid Resilience grants for $5 billion. And we'll talk about the breakdown within that. So preventing outages and enhancing the resilience of the electric grid. So that, again, included $2.5 billion in funding for the Grid Resilience Utility and Industry grants. Those are matching grants that Department of Energy awards directly to for-profit entities. And that is the reason for the supplemental regulations at 2 CFR 910 and pretty much why we're having this session. As you know, it is not the norm for the government to award grants to for-profit entities. So this, again, has created the need for some supplemental guidance. So $2.5 billion is available in funding for the Grid Resilience State and Tribal Formula Grant Program, and we call that the Formula Grants. And that $5 billion is to be dispersed from 2022 to 2026. Now, the purpose of these grants is to prevent disruptive events due to climate change, or to at least mitigate the negative effects of the disruptive event. Definition of a disruptive event is an event in which operations of the electric grid are disrupted, preventatively shut off, or cannot operate safely due to extreme weather, wildfire, or a natural disaster. Now, obviously, this act was passed, Subtitle A, specifically before the tragedy in Maui, but it really reads as if it was drafted for Maui. And of course, the conclusion there was that the start of the wildfire was active power lines falling, given the 90-mile-per-hour winds from Hurricane Dora that was actually hundreds of miles away. Now, the eligible entities in here, with respect to that initial $2.5 billion tranche of the grid resiliency funding, eligible entities, as you can see, electric grid operator, electricity storage generator, operator and generator, transmission owner or operator, distribution or fuel provider, and then it's kind of a catch-all for whatever the secretary of the DOE deems an eligible entity. But I think what this means is that the government recognizes that this problem, climate change and the natural disasters that have resulted, is really too big. It's too far-reaching for one entity in one sector to handle. So the government has to take a much more holistic approach, and it has to foster a collaborative effort among government, industry, and higher education. And in fact, last Thursday, there was an article in the New York Times that talked about the percentage of government spending on research and development relative to GDP. And not surprisingly, given the space race in the 1960s, the peak was 2% in terms of R&D as a percentage of GDP. So the spending declined from that point, but it did rebound in 1980 to approximately 1.3%. Currently, the relative spending is 0.8%, so that's 0.8%, down from that peak again of 2% and a recent years of 1.3%, which would say that the federal government really needs partnerships if it is seeking innovative solutions, to preclude or mitigate the effects of natural disasters. The government just has not been spending on that kind of research. So as of October 18th, with respect to this particular grant, the utility and industry grants, the DOE awarded $920 million, so almost $1 billion, to 16 of those eligible entities. And in terms of the awards, the priority projects are those that will generate the greatest community benefit in reducing the likelihood and consequences of disruptive events. And in terms of those disruptive events, kind of a cruel irony with respect to our Sandy funding, the Atlantic City Resilience Program, or creating mitigation measures in Atlantic City, included floodproofing for the Atlantic City City Hall. The Atlantic City City Hall had housed their emergency management operations. And when Hurricane Sandy went through, the flooding included the flooding at City Hall, and in fact, had power consequences that disabled the emergency management in Atlantic City. So again, what can we do with respect to the greatest community benefits to reducing these negative effects? And keep in mind also, what we're talking about today are natural disasters. We're not even talking about cybersecurity and the grid. And I think the Wall Street Journal recently noted that the attacks on the grid, cybersecurity attacks, are up 700% year over year. And that's a discussion for another day. Okay, so the utility and industry grants are awarded to eligible entities for activities that supplement existing hardening efforts of the eligible entity that are planned for any given year. So in other words, the funding isn't for brand new projects. The funding is going, I believe, to mitigate some risk to existing hardening efforts, reduce the risk to losing taxpayer dollars, obviously, and then also reduce the optics, if not the actuality, that the government is giving companies free money, for-profit companies. The activities also must reduce the risk of any power lines owned or operated by the eligible entity would cause a wildfire, or increase the ability of the eligible entity to reduce the likelihood and consequences of disruptive events. And why might a for-profit entity have started these efforts? You may remember that in 2019, Pacific Gas and Electric signed a settlement for $13.5 billion with victims of the California wildfires. So it is very much in the interests of the eligible entities to have started these efforts. So the other part of the grid resilience grants is the state and tribal formula grants. This is to support communities in strengthening and modernizing America's power grid against wildfires, extreme weather, and other natural disasters that are exacerbated by the climate crisis. And the states and Indian tribes receiving these grants are pass-through entities. The grant funds ultimately are distributed to eligible entities. And I would think that many of you have been recipients, or your states have been recipients of these formula grants. In fact, 48 states were awarded these grants for a total of $748 million. So that's under Section 40101 of Title I. And again, these are pass-through entities, which implicates a monitoring responsibility. So even if you're familiar with the uniform guidance from other grants, 2 CFR 200, given the additional provisions in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, specifically concerning these recipients or subrecipients and their nature, if you receive one of these awards, you probably should become familiar with 2 CFR 910 as well. Okay, so there's a formula for the distribution of these funds, the allocation based on factors such as population size, land area, the probability and severity of disruptive events, and the locality's prior expenditures on mitigation efforts. And the state had to provide its plan to the Department of Energy with respect to how it would ultimately distribute those grant funds and the expected outcome. The other program that I'd like to touch on here is the next section, Section 40103, and that's the Electric Grid Reliability and Resilience Research, Development, and Demonstration. So this truly is grant making for research for innovation. This is also $5 billion in funding available, plus there's an additional $1 billion in funding specifically for rural or remote areas to upgrade their energy infrastructure or develop microgrids, increase efficiencies, and so forth. And the Grid Innovation Program, again, provides financial assistance to foster that collaboration. Again, the government recognizes the federal government cannot do this alone. The states can't do this alone. We must foster collaboration with electric sector owners and operators to deploy projects that use innovative approaches to transmission, storage, and distribution infrastructure to harden and enhance the grid resilience and reliability, and that will demonstrate new approaches to enhance the regional grid resilience implemented through the states by public and rural cooperative entities on a cost-shared basis. The eligible entities for the Grid Innovation Program are a single state, multiple cooperating states, Indian tribes, local governments, or public utility commissions. And as October 18th, we had over $1.4 billion awarded by the DOE for 8 projects. So again, these are huge projects, huge research undertakings. Now, there are some restrictions built into this legislation, into the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. For example, the award to an eligible entity, that's a for-profit entity, cannot exceed the total amount that the entity has spent in the prior 3 years on efforts to reduce the likelihood and consequences of disruptive events. So there has to be some activity on the part of the eligible entity that they are serious about mitigating these disruptive events. Whereas the states and Indian tribes have a 5% allocation for administrative expenses, eligible entities, as you may imagine, have no such allocation. And the matching requirement for states and Indian tribes is 15%, but for eligible entities, it is 100%. So it's a full match of the federal grant funds. And I think this slide kind of illustrates the tensions between the government realizing that there's really a need to collaborate with entities that may be for-profit entities, but there must be a limit to the risk in terms of extending those funds because for-profits do go out of business. Plus, the government has to preclude, again, the perception or the actuality of a giveaway of taxpayer dollars. So we have Section 2, CFR 910.120, adopting the 2 CFR 200 uniform guidance with several important additions and substitutions as a result. Okay, so let's touch on the uniform guidance. And of course, that is the formally the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. It's a bit of a misnomer because it's not guidance. These are actually requirements. But with the exceptions noted in 2 CFR 910, the uniform guidance still applies. That's our default here. And this includes the requirement to monitor subrecipients. In terms of what has stayed the same or what still applies, most notably from the uniform guidance, includes the conflict of interest rules. Again, you have to have a written policy detailing your steps to prevent a conflict of interest. Most notably in subpart C, the procurement rules still apply. And I have found through the ARPA administration that the most problematic aspect of award for I guess entities, I would say, that are not used to receiving federal funding is the procurement aspect. Free and open competition, the Appendix 2 that contains the mandatory clauses for contracts with federal funds. It is very easy to bypass some of these rules. We found, particularly with some of the hospitals or some of the civic centers, theaters would have received ARP funding for the recovery, economic recovery, and they'd run out and go to their usual contractor, the firm that they're used to dealing with and that has always done a great job for them. And that's not necessarily free and open competition. So I think this is one of the easiest provisions in terms of tripping up a recipient or subrecipient. And again, what still applies is the requirement to monitor subrecipients and recipients. So when a non-federal entity, such as a state or local government, passes through funds to subrecipients, it becomes a pass-through entity. And pass-through entities must monitor subrecipients to ensure that, first, the subaward is used for authorized purposes, is in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the subaward. Plus, the monitoring must make sure that the subaward performance goals are achieved. And I think the second point on this slide is probably the difference between monitoring and auditing. Whereas auditing focuses on financial performance at a particular point in time, monitoring concerns itself ultimately that the funds are spent in a way that achieves the goal. What was the goal of the program? Is in fact the program achieving that goal? And for purposes of determining which subrecipients will be monitored and how, pass-through entities are required to evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the subaward. So required to evaluate each subrecipient's risk. And that entails a risk assessment. And risk assessments consider various factors, such as the amount of funding. Larger grants are obviously at greater risk. The number of beneficiaries, the more beneficiaries, the higher the risk profile of the program. Experience with federal grants. Obviously, more experience is better, less risky. And the risk assessments are really probably the biggest product or deliverable for our clients. You have to rank. We all have limited resources. You basically have to rank order in terms of your monitoring. So the requirements for subrecipient monitoring: reviewing financial and performance reports required by the pass-through entity, ensuring that the subrecipient takes timely and appropriate action on all deficiencies pertaining to the federal award, whether detected through audits, on-site reviews, written confirmation from the subrecipient. In other words, is the subrecipient taking corrective measures? The grantee must also issue a management decision for the applicable audit findings and resolve audit findings, seeing that the entity or subrecipient resolved audit findings specifically related to the subaward. And as we talked about, auditing and monitoring are not the same thing. Conducting an audit does not satisfy the requirement to conduct subrecipient monitoring any more than monitoring satisfies the requirement to conduct an audit. And particularly as it comes to monitoring methodologies, whereas the uniform guidance says you must monitor, it does not dictate the methodology, the tools, or timelines, because the monitoring is specific to the needs of the grant program at hand, so that it's a flexible program depending on exactly what the nature of the program is. So let's take a look at some of the key provisions of 2 CFR 910. I call it the supplemental guidance. Right at the beginning, threshold. The 2 CFR 910 expands the definition of a non-federal entity. According to the uniform guidance, a non-federal entity is a state, local government, Indian tribe, institution of higher education, or nonprofit organization that carries out a federal award as a recipient or a subrecipient. Add to that, according to 2 CFR 910, for-profit entities. And a for-profit organization is defined as one that distributes any profit not reinvested into the business as profit or dividends to its employees or shareholders. Again, threshold measure here. Who's eligible? What for-profits are eligible for these grants? So to be eligible for a federal award, the Department of Energy must determine that the for-profit entity's participation in the program would be in the economic interest of the United States. Again, the government is not awarding grants to benefit shareholders. The result of this grant must be in the economic interest of the United States. which would include investments by the applicant company and its affiliates in R&D and manufacturing in the U.S., significant contributions to employment in the U.S. by the applicant company and affiliates, and the applicant must sign an agreement regarding the technology that's produced from the financial assistance to promote manufacture within the U.S. and procure parts and materials from competitive suppliers. Also, the for-profit entity must be either a U.S.-owned company or incorporated or organized, such as an LLC, under the laws of any state, and the parent company of the foreign company must be incorporated or organized under the laws of a country which affords U.S. companies essentially the same opportunities that they afford any other companies, whether their own domestic companies or not. And the nation must have adequate and effective protection for intellectual property rights. Again, key when you're talking about innovation, research and development, as we're talking about generally with these grants. Now, in lieu of a single audit, entities that expend $750,000 or more of federal funds in a fiscal year, or federal grant funds, I should say, they must undergo not a single audit, but a compliance audit, as defined in 2 CFR 910 subpart F. Now, subpart F for the uniform guidance pertains to the audit requirements. Subpart F in the supplemental guidance pertains to the compliance audit. And the regulators set up these, it's the same subpart F, with the same numbering in terms of their provisions so that one can directly compare provision in the supplemental guidance to the uniform guidance provisions. According to the AICPA, a compliance audit is a program-specific audit or an organization-wide audit of an entity's compliance with applicable compliance requirements. Now, a single audit combines an audit of an entity's financial statements along with the audit of compliance with federal award requirements. Auditees must, as a non-federal entity, all non-federal entities must prepare their financial statements. Okay, this is under the uniform guidance. But under the supplemental guidance, for-profit entities must provide their financial statements if they are available. Right, so non-federal entities, is defined in the uniform guidance, must prepare financial statements. For-profit entities provide them if they are available. So 2 thoughts here. First of all, given that the for-profit entity files a tax return and presumably prepares income and cash flow statements for its owners, there's probably a safe assumption that the for-profit entity has financial statements. But the compliance audit addresses what is probably new to the for-profit entity, and that is compliance with federal grant regulations. So I think the supplemental guidance is emphasizing that compliance aspect for the for-profit entities, again, that are probably not used to receiving grants from the federal government. In terms of intellectual property, and again, this is a measure to limit any kind of a windfall or enrichment to the for-profit, because if the for-profit recipient is not a small business, but receives an award or subaward for research, development, and demonstration activities, the Department of Energy owns the patent rights to inventions made under the award. Okay, so DOE owns the patent rights to these inventions that result from these grants. Another change with respect to cost principles. For the for-profit entities, the cost principles that are contained in the uniform guidance under section 200.400 are replaced by the cost principles contained in 48 CFR 31.2, which is contracts with commercial organizations. For both sets of regulations, allowable costs must be reasonable, allocable, in other words, tied specifically to that award. They must comply with GAAP or cost accounting standards, comply, of course, with the terms of the award, and with any limitations that the subpart may address. Again, some cost principles that are not contained in the uniform guidance because they do apply specifically to commercial entities. Independent research and development costs are allowable as indirect expenses to the extent they're reasonable and allocable. And manufacturing and production engineering costs are allowable to the extent they relate to new or improved material, processes, and techniques, including pilot production lines. So these are all allowable costs with respect to their grant funding. With respect to payments, the uniform guidance requires that non-federal entities are paid in advance if certain conditions are met. Not surprisingly, the supplemental guidance states that reimbursement is the preferred method of payment for the for-profit non-federal entities. Again, the government is not going to issue tax-free loans to for-profit entities, so it's reimbursement as the general rule. Now, we are getting near the end of our presentation today, and one of the key impression that we hope you take away is that the federal government is taking the issue of preventing and mitigating disruptive events very seriously, is taking some pretty important actions, strong actions, and it is fostering, as a consequence, cross-sector collaboration that includes the private sector. And in fact, alluded to ARPA earlier, the interim final rule for ARPA that was issued in September added another eligibility category to ARPA, and that was recovery from natural disasters. So we obviously see much more frequently natural disasters in the last year or so, and those costs can be recovered through ARPA funds. But recovery also includes mitigation for future disasters, future natural disasters. So again, ARPA includes some mitigation measures as well. Again, the government trying to, in many ways, do as much as it can to address this problem. Another key takeaway as a pass-through entity is the need for a monitoring program. And if you look or feel remotely like this person, our Vanderweel website, as Jillian mentioned, has helpful publications in our resources section as to monitoring approaches, compliance, meaningful monitoring that I think you'd find very helpful. And our firm specializes in helping our clients create monitoring plans, create monitoring programs. And as this slide indicates, grant funds may be used to cover the costs associated with monitoring. That includes hiring a monitoring firm.